How'd you like to listen to .NET Rocks with no ads? Easy. Become a patron. For just $5 a month, you get access to a private RSS feed where all the shows have no ads. $20 a month will get you that and a special .NET Rocks patron mug. Sign up now at patreon.netrocks.com.
Hey, Carl and Richard here with your 2024 NDC schedule.
We'll be at as many NDC conferences as possible this year, and you should consider attending no matter what.
NDC Oslo is happening June 10th through the 14th. Get your tickets at ndcoslo.com.
The Copenhagen Developers Festival happens August 26th through the 30th. Early bird discount ends April 26th. Tickets at cphdevfest.com.
NDC Porto is happening October 14th through the 18th. The early bird discount ends June 14th. Tickets at ndcporto.com.
We'll see you there. We hope. Hey, get down, rock and roll. It's .NET Rocks. I'm Carl Franklin.
And I'm Richard Campbell.
And Scott Hunter is with us. We'll bring him in a minute. But how's everything going up in the great western north?
It's springtime, and springtime is good. We're putting in vegetable gardens.
Wow.
It's now that we're living up here full time, you see things differently.
Do you have as many bears there that are going to come and eat your vegetables?
No, a lot fewer. The issue here will be deer.
Yeah.
So we actually had to put deer fencing around the garden.
Oh, dear.
But we'll find out if you don't find out it works until you're actually growing things and they're eating it anyway. So we'll find out soon enough. But
Season 1, feed the deer. Season 2,
yeah,
keep the deer away.
Feed the deer less.
Feed the deer less.
But we were talking about it, and she said, I said, this will be an arms race. We'll see what we've put out our first salvo. Let's see what they come with. We'll figure it out from there.
So here, the weather hasn't made up its mind in Connecticut. The couple days ago, it was like in the 30s overnight, and today it's going to be 80.
Oh, man.
It's going to be 80, dude.
It's like summertime, just like that.
Yeah. And next week, it'll be raining and cold again. So. All right. Well, let's dive right into this thing with a little thing that I call Better Know Framework.
All right, dude, what do you got?
Okay, well, I mentioned this maybe a week ago or two, but there's a new Blazor masterclass happening in September in Tuscany.
Very nice.
And the reason I wanted to mention it with a real URL here, which is codeinacastle.com, or since it's 1897, 1897.pwop.me, is that there's an early bird discount. You can save $500 if you sign up by next week. May 15th is the deadline for the early bird.
Okay.
But what's cool about it is if you go there and you watch the video, I actually made a video from last year, and I think that brings the experience home, because I talked to the people and I took their pictures that they took as tourists out in Tuscany, and, did a little Ken Burns treatment to some Tuscan music, to some Neapolitan songs, some Pavarotti, and some Puccini. Anyway, so it's really great. Basically, it's Code in a Castle, and you spend a week in a castle with your significant other, like in a castle bedroom, having meals and on the grounds and seeing Tuscany. And the first 4 hours of the day, we're in class, 9 to 1, and then everybody meets up, and the rest of the day is all sightseeing and tourism. And the plus ones, or the significant others, they get to spend the morning doing things that, we don't do.
Nice.
They go out and the cheese shops, the olive oil shops, the beaches, all that stuff, and they do morning activities that are strictly for them. It's just a great thing.
You've modernized the immersive event, Carl. I think it's pretty cool.
Yeah, and I got to say, I didn't do this. It wasn't my idea. It was Larry Lustig's idea, who's been a longtime listener of .NET Rocks, and also a keto guy, right?
Right. And
he and his friend Marco, who lives in New York now but grew up in Tuscany and is from Rome, they put this whole thing together, and kudos to them, because the traincation has begun.
Yeah.
The traincation revolution.
No, it's a good idea to just mix the two together.
And Scott Hunter almost came last year, right, Scott?
I did almost come last year, and maybe this year will be a better year for me to have a chance to come. It just comes down if I have too much travel booked up. Like, I've currently overbooked myself right now, and I need to unoverbook myself.
Right. Maybe a week in Tuscany is just the ticket to relax a little bit. Maybe.
My fear there, Carl, is my wife's going to want me to stay for a month. That's the problem.
That's not.
Tell me the downside.
Well, this castle is something that you just can't book like a hotel. You have to have a group, and that's why it's so special. Is that we get a group together, and then because of that, we own the castle. Like there's nobody else there but our group.
Nice.
And so it's not anything that you could experience any other way. Anyway,
cool, man.
That's what I got. Who's talking to us today, Richard?
Grabbed a comment off a show, 1889, the one we did with one Magnus Martinson. You know him.
Yeah.
When we were talking about Azure, lots of people liked this conversation. It was a very popular show. By any standards. And Code Pooter, that's Richard Rakima, who's been on the show as well, and a regular commenter, had this great.
And he was at Code in the Castle last year.
And he was at Code in the Castle.
He was.
Yeah, I love his comment. It's 4 a.m. What a good show. I think your perception was distorted at that time, Rich. You were up pretty late. For most organization, cloud migration looks like utopia when it's really a minefield. Why? Perspective. As Magnus points out, organizations have skilled operations which traditionally manage shared physical resources, one server or one backplane, in many applications. So cloud migration is a migration of that, meaning the backplane and the infrastructure, rather than the migration of the applications to a dynamic, scalable resource. Moving to dynamic scale is where IT operations can fall short. In cloud, from a business perspective, the resources they require are services, not servers. Good line.
Love it.
Good line, man. This is the change in perspective. Resources the businesses require, and putting applications on those resources that will scale in and out based on business demand using time frames of minutes rather than months. I got nothing to add. He nailed it. It's great. It's a great point. It's like, listen, this is not, if you're just thinking about dev when you're moving to cloud, you're missing out. You need your operations folks on board. It's a change in the way they think too.
Yeah.
It will affect the way we build software. It's why we move up to services, because then you get that scalability. But, I've been thinking a lot lately about the software angle of not just get it there, get to the new platform, but then really taking advantage of the platform. But I think they're two logical steps. First, you got to get there. Then there is an optimization that has to take place to really take advantage of what you've got. And part of that will save money, reduce impact, optimize for better scale for new business opportunities. Like all of those things come, but you do have to get there.
Yep.
Rich, I know you got a copy of Music Code By, but I got to call it out as always. If you'd like a copy of Music Code By, write a comment on the website at .netrocks.com or on the Facebooks. We publish every show there. And every reading on the show, we'll send you a copy of Music Code By.
And you could follow us on the Facebooks and on Twitter, of course, or X or whatever the hell we're calling it these days. But the cool kids are hanging out on Mastodon. I'm at Carl Franklin at techhub.social.
And I'm Rich Campbell at mastodon.social.
Send us a toot. And that's a really great way to get a hold of us because there's less noise for the time being. And that brings us to you, Scott. Scott Hunter is the VP of Product for Azure Developer Experience. He builds all the .NET tools for Azure and used to be in charge of all the .NET. And that's, what more can you say? All the .NET.
He was all the .NET.
Now he's a little more focused on Azure and .NET tools for Azure. Welcome back, Scott.
Thanks for having me back, guys. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, a bit too long, friend. And certainly, all this ties together with, I'm glad you're there helping us be better at cloud, because it's hard. I think about the move we made onto the internet, from WinForms to web forms. And then pretty quickly, as you get familiar with that, you're like, hey, there's a better way to do web stuff. And we went MVC and others. I kind of feel like we're in the same place right now with cloud. We got there. Now we got to get better at it.
It feels like we're at Cloud 101 to me. If I think of it from a tools perspective, it really feels like we're at Cloud 101. And I'll kind of explain. Way back in the day, when I was in the ASP.NET team, and we, Scott Guthrie, the EVP of Cloud and AI at Microsoft, he left DevDiv and became the EVP of that tech. We moved over there, and our job was to go build tools to help you as a .NET developer be able to get your application up into Azure. And I think of the tools we built, and they're good tools. I mean, you can, some people laugh. It's the right-click publish tools. I got some data just a week ago that tool's used 800,000 times a month.
Wow.
That's great.
Now, of course, that's not for production. That's going to be for just doing developer inner loop.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah,
exactly. So when people say, don't let your friends right click publish, that's BS. The reality is,
it is BS.
As a developer, that's exactly what you're going to do. Because if you go through your operations team, your IT operations team, it's going to be 10 or 15 or 20 minutes every time you make a change for them to go run their pipeline to get your code up there.
Right.
But I said we're at kind of Azure 101 or Cloud 101 because right click publish, it publishes what? A single application.
Yeah.
How many cloud apps today do we think on, I'll ask the callers, how many people do we think are actually building an app that's I just have a web front end.
Right.
I don't have a web back end. I don't have any of the other pieces of that pie.
Right.
And so that's why I say we're kind of at Cloud 101 is we're great for if you want to work on a single application, and I can parlay this in many ways. If you're in VS Code and you have a front end and a back end, what are you likely to do? I'm going to run 2 VS Codes. I'm going to run one for the front end, one for the back end. I'm going to start them both. It's kind of klutzy.
Yeah. This is why I like Studio. We have the concept of a solution and having multiple projects.
But even Studio is klutzy. I mean, in Studio, how many people know you can right click on a solution and say manage startup projects, and then you can select multi, and then set the order the projects start and all those types of things.
Yeah.
Super important. But I don't think those tools that's not the best developer experience. And if you run that experience, you have to choose which ones you want to debug.
Yeah.
You can decide to start them all with a debugger or start some with the debugger out. And to change that, you've got to go into the goofy dialog box and change stuff. I don't think that experience is a great experience. And so it's been I've said for a while, Visual Studio is great for single apps.
Right.
VS Code is great for single apps, but we need to build great multi-app tools because that's how customers are actually building, cloud apps today.
And should be building them, right? Like this idea of separate services.
Of course, we've evolved as developers, knowing what we have in these tools and knowing how to be more efficient. Like I can remember the day the light bulb went off, and anytime, because what I was doing was anytime I had a change to any like config file or any JSON file where data was kept or anything like that, I would publish a new version, everything, kick everybody off the site. And then I discovered, FileZilla, FTP, and I could just go in there and copy over some new image files or some new static files or whatever, and everything would just work. I see this as not only an evolution of tools, but an evolution of how we use those tools and how we get better as programmers.
So let's kind of talk about what I think the future is for this kind of space. And I'm going to start with the tool that my team built, and we shipped it at Build last year. So that's May of 2023. We built a tool called the Azure Developer CLI. And the genesis of this tool was, I'll be very frank, we have lots of .NET customers using Azure, and they are the majority. And we wanted, in my current team, we want to make sure that we can get more Java developers, more Python developers, more Node developers. The reality is I don't think it's a either or rule anymore. I believe most companies are using a variety of technologies. And so nobody builds something entirely in one stack. That's the old classic 20-year-old Microsoft customer. I do believe that we all have, if you're doing some AI, you might have some Python. If you're doing some front-end web, you might have, some JavaScript or some Blazor. But we built this tool because we had various samples that we had created for Azure. And on one of these days, we were doing a user study where we actually get on a phone call, and we got on a phone call with a bunch of Python developers and said, "Hey, here's this Python tutorial for getting your Flask app up into Azure, and your goal is to get this up, before we get off the call." So it's a quick call. It's 30 minutes. At the 30-minute mark, not a single customer has actually published their Python app to Azure.
Wow.
In most cases, where they're at is they're installing stuff.
Still. That sounds like my Python experience too.
They weren't installing Python, Richard. They were actually, we have this thing called AZ. It's the Azure CLI. And it's the way that you would, manually provision Azure from the command line. At the time, we have fixed this install. At the time, the install for that was not very fast. Many of these Python customers were using PyCharm. They were not using VS Code. Mm-hmm. And what do our docs say? Our docs say install VS Code. So here they are going, I have to install a different developer tool. I've got to install this AZ thing. I then have to authenticate all these things together. I've got to install the Python extension for VS Code. Mm-hmm. And we're like, wow, this is not good.
It's clumsy.
We're 30 minutes in and nothing's going on. And so we built a tool to address that exact problem, which is like what you do is with AZD, that's the Azure Developer CLI, it's a single exe, which means it does not require an MSI installer or anything like that. You can actually Xcopy or just copy the file to your computer, and you'd only need the one file to do all this kind of stuff. And templates can be marked with some special folders. There's a folder called infra, and that would contain the bicep, which is that's the definition language for Azure. Azure is actually built on top of something called ARM, and then bicep is an abstraction on top of ARM to make ARM easier to use. But you've got this bicep in there, and then literally now I can take the repo, I can clone it, and I can say AZD init, give it a name. I can do AZD up, tell it what data center I want to use, region I should say, and subscription, and then the whole process just takes off. And no longer am I running command line scripts. I'm not installing command line stuff. You get that great experience. And so we built this experience, and we haven't got as far as I want in it. But a real change happened about 6 months ago. The .NET team is working on .NET Aspire. That's their cloud native framework on top of .NET. And Aspire is super exciting to me as a .NET developer. What I'd like to tell people is we built all this great capability into .NET, ASP.NET Core years ago. We have the ability to do an HTTP client factory. And you can actually use something like Poly to set resilience rules on top of that. Mm-hmm. We built tech for EF Core that lets you do retry policies. When you're in the cloud, you might need to be more resilient. We added open telemetry APIs to .NET a couple of years ago. But all this stuff I just described, we didn't turn any of it on by default. And so, if you happen to watch a video of Glenn Condron and me in .NET Core 3 days, you would have seen us show the HTTP resiliency stuff. But if you missed any of those things, you don't know how to do this. And so we kind of learned that if you're a .NET developer, lots of challenges come when you start trying to run your app in the cloud, and we don't really help you. Right. And so the Aspire framework is literally, hey, let's give you a paved path with all the right things. And so where this gets interesting is the Aspire folks obviously want to make their tech, it'd be great if you could publish an Aspire application. It's going to be a multi-part application. Mm-hmm. You can publish that application to a cloud. And we all got together and had a conversation. It's like, hey, does the Visual Studio team build this? Do we use the AZD tech that my team has built? Do they build something new? And we kind of all came to an agreement we should all just centralize on one piece of tech that actually does this. And it already supported, multi-project applications, already AZD. And so we've built AZD to understand a .NET Aspire application.
Interesting.
And so if people don't know what Aspire is, I was mentioning before, I thought our Visual Studio tools were kind of clumsy. When you create an Aspire application or you add Aspire to an existing ASP.NET Core project, what happens is we create an app host project, and we create a service default project in your solution. So if you got your classic Razor page or Blazor application or web API, we add this new app host, and it's kind of the magic. It's the orchestrator. And so the idea is the app host, you codify inside of it. There's a builder like we've had in the ASP.NET Core Tech forever. And with the builder, you can add a project. You can add multiple projects. When you control F5, we run that project. And that's project jobs to start all the sub-projects that depend on it. That's why it's the orchestrator.
Right.
And so imagine you got a front end, you got a back end. You can do a with reference. Your front end, you say with reference to the front end. That tells the tech, order is important. Start this before you start that. That's kind of the genesis of a .NET Aspire project.
And by the way, everything's configured for you to fall into the pit of success.
Yes.
You don't have to worry about, how do I do that, HTTP client factory thing again? I can't remember that.
Yes. So there's that default project that is added to your solution as well. And we inject a call to that in each of your projects that you would add Aspire orchestration to. And so if you just trace the code of that, that's going to turn open telemetry on, which means you're going to have proper telemetry. It's going to turn the retry stuff on. So your APIs and stuff like that, your HTTP clients are going to actually be resilient. It's going to turn on service discovery, which is my favorite feature. And when I say we're kind of cloud 101 when it comes to our right-click publish tech, service discovery is a big piece of this. Let me just quickly go through each of those things. Open telemetry, we'd love if you're running an app in the cloud, you'd like to have telemetry, right? You'd like to see how it's running, where the crashes are, how long things take, what's the order of execution. We've had those APIs in .NET for a while, but they're not on by default. The resiliency we've already talked about. I want to have a retry policy. So if my API has a problem, it tries again. Because I'll be honest with you, in a big cloud network is kind of virtualized and it does, have its moments.
Things don't always work the first time, but if you just try a little while later, you'll probably be all right.
Probably okay. And then finally, we've all done this. If you've been using ASP.NET Core, and you build a multi-part project, what do? You go into a folder, you open up the launch settings, you find out what, localhost port you're on, you hard code the port into your other application. And then when you push this thing to the cloud, you have to go find some way to go fix all those to map to the real, things in the cloud.
So service discovery.
Yeah. Service discovery is. And so service discovery, in an Aspire application in that app host, as you add a project or a service or whatever, you give them all names. And then when you reference those from your applications, you use the names, not the actual low level, local host and port numbers and all that kind of stuff.
All the individual components.
And that's important. Yeah, that's important because locally we can do all the magic for you. And then on the cloud push, we can also change those from being localhost :XYZ to Azure Container App whatever terminology the cloud thing that you're going to go publish to is. And so suddenly I've got a great Control F5 experience locally. I can actually publish the app and it still runs in the cloud. And then that's where my toolchain comes into play. So what your next step is to basically take that application. And I'm going to go the low level way first. I would go to command line. And in the folder, the root folder of the application, or I should say applications, if it's a solution with multiple projects.
Right.
And I would type AZDinit. And when I type that, it's going to ask me for a name for my thing, my resource name. Well, first off, it's going to scan. So it's going to say, do you want me to scan? If you press return, it's going to scan the folder. It's going to go find, hey, I see an Aspire thing here. It's going to say, I found an Aspire application. What name would you like to use for this as I publish it? You give it a name, and then you're done. And what it's going to do is it's going to create an Azure.YAML, which kind of describes what's going on. And it doesn't do much more than that at this point. But what you can do at that point, you can say AZD up, and then it's going to go ask you, what is your Azure subscription? It's going to say, what region do you want this application to run in? And once you answer those questions, it's going to start building this application and publishing it to the cloud for you.
Wow.
Now there's a couple cool things here. In this Aspire case, typically you're going to publish this to containers in the cloud. Well, if I'm a container dev, does that mean, oh crap, I need to know what Docker files are? I need to know what Helm charts are.
Yeah. Kubernetes and all that stuff.
Do I need to have Docker desktop installed? And the answer is no, and no. we can actually build the entire application, because in .NET 7, we added the ability to actually build containers without having any of those types of tools on your machine.
So it's not just that you're using those tools under the hood and hiding them from us. You're actually not even using them.
We're not even using them.
Yeah.
And that's a cool thing. Is like one of the
that
things
is a very cool thing.
So this isn't going to AKS?
So you can go to AKS as well.
Okay.
I mean, once again, we're just building,
but it's not by default.
We're just building containers.
Okay.
And so, once you build a container in the cloud world, what you typically do is you're going to publish your container to a container registry.
Right.
And then the service of your choice, whether it's something like Azure Container Apps or it's AKS, it's going to have an action where it's going to pull that image and boot that image up. And so the build aspect of it is actually kind of irrelevant for the most part. For 1.0 of Aspire, which is going to be out in the build time frame, it'll GA at build 2024. We default these applications to Azure Container Apps. But I should step back and say, with Preview 6, our friends at AWS have built their tool chain for this as well. And so this tech is not, we're not trying to make Aspire be an Azure only thing. It's meant to be a pluggable ecosystem where you can plug the tools in for whoever you are. So if you're Google or AWS, this all works there as well. The AWS folks have already written some of the tech, so you can publish these to AWS. And we have some tools where you can actually publish our thing to Azure Kubernetes Service as well, if that's your choice. But by default today, it's going to do container apps, and part of that is I would always say, let's get one of these things really good right first before we go and try to do like multiple options. But that AZD up, it's going to go provision all the resources, get your app running in the cloud. The service discovery is going to mean you don't have to worry about changing the ports and the IP addresses of the individual applications. It's all just going to work. I said a lot of CLI here. You can also go to Visual Studio. You can right click on that app host project and you can select publish. And what's going to happen is behind the scenes, it's going to do the same steps I just described. It's going to ask you a couple of questions. It's going to then actually run AZD for you. And AZD actually creates some assets. It's going to create those assets and make sure you never see them. So it kind of hides the whole thing.
I mean, arguably, that means you could deploy an Aspire app to your local container store too, on-prem.
Yes, you could.
Yeah. Like it's just containers. Run them where you want.
Yeah.
Run them where you want. But I'm excited that we built this tool, and you folks have been along for the whole .NET Core journey. And we said with .NET Core, we're going to start with command line because everybody has command line. And so I'm excited that with Aspire and AZD, we start with command line, which means if I'm a VS Code developer, I've got a multi-part project, I can just AZD up that thing. If I'm in Visual Studio, I can obviously do the right-click publish, and we're going to, up that thing. And, unlike what we said before, this is not the single right-click publish where I can only do my front end manually or my back end.
Right.
This takes the entire app. We have that eShop, which is one of the samples we've had in .NET for a long time. That's got like 8 containers and databases and RabbitMQs and a bunch of stuff like that. And you can AZD up that thing and it'll put that whole app in the cloud. And so it feels like we've graduated from single app or single piece of an app to now we can do your whole app.
The proper multi-app. I mean, this is what we used to spend a lot of time with when we were building these distributed apps, building CI/CD pipelines for them.
Yes.
Was making sure all those different pieces got their updates and rolled out in the right order and so forth. Like, dude, that was a lot of YAML.
A lot of YAML.
That you had to craft yourself.
My favorite language.
And guys, I'm going to interrupt for one moment for this very important message. And we're back. It's .NET Rocks. I'm Richard Campbell. That's Carl Franklin.
Hey.
Talking to our friend Scott Hunter about, really, I love this thinking that all cloud apps are multiple apps. And most of our tools are oriented on single apps. So how do we get to better tooling that thinks multi-app? And also when it comes to cloud, like what you're talking with Aspire is, there is a natural hierarchy. If it's an Aspire app, there is an orchestrator. That's where you begin on a lot of stuff. And so the CLI tools and all the tooling, when they see an Aspire app, go, oh, let's talk to the orchestrator first. That would be the first piece that needs to be deployed, and then pull in each of the services. Like, It's not an amorphous blob. There is a distinct set of layers here.
Yeah, I laugh because I cannot remember the project. Maybe you do, Richard. There was a project like this in the early Azure days. Somebody that's listening to this podcast will actually reply to us and tell us what it was. But there was, I remember back in early Azure days, we had some visual tool where you actually had a whole XML file that described your application.
Right.
And I'm going to laugh because that was too complicated. I think this is a much better version of that. I forget what that thing was called.
But we've talked about this for years, right? Exactly that. There's going to be this tool where you're going to draw out all these bits and set up, and it's going to generate the orchestration for you.
As much as I've complained about YAML, XML is worse.
Yep, true.
I'd much rather have YAML than XML to deal with.
True enough.
I will tell you that as well. XML just hurts.
It hurts.
It just hurts, and it feels like, I mean, all these file formats are a little rough because I feel like if I make an error in any of them, they're not forgiving of errors.
Right.
But XML, as we added schema and all these other things to it, it just felt like it just became this huge pile of complicated tech.
Yeah, but this whole deployment pipeline stuff and writing all that YAML, it's still super bespoke. Like every app, you end up crafting your own. At best, it's cut and paste. Like I feel like we're feeling around with stuff like Bicep and Pulumi, feeling around for reusable chunks of deployment management. I just haven't seen a good solution yet.
I don't think we have a good solution. I'll be honest with you. Even inside of Microsoft, when we first started doing modern Azure, we had ARM, which is this description JSON file that describes all the app. And the problem is, like any of us on this call, if I want an app service, I'm like, well, I want an app service with 4 CPUs and 32 gigs of RAM and X amount of storage. But if I define that definition in ARM, I'm going to start talking about the networking layers and all this stuff that is just, that's beyond me. I just, if I go to the Azure portal, I just say I want an app service with this much stuff in it in this area. And what it does is it kind of creates all that other stuff for me behind the scenes. And so Bicep is a little better. But one of the things that we're exploring is can we build what we call Bicep modules that actually have a bunch of smart defaults in them? So I don't have to describe
Bicep for us.
Yes. And so I will tell you, my team thinks about this all the time. We have a work stream looking at this today. It's like, we don't want to build, another abstraction on top of Bicep. We've already got 2 abstractions, ARM and Bicep. Let's not build another one, but is there a way to go add smart defaults? And if you're a customer, if you go to the Azure portal and create a resource, you did get a bunch of smart defaults. You didn't answer 85 questions to build an app service. You answered 4 or 5. If you run AZ, the Azure command line tool, once again, it's the same kind of thing. You don't specify every single thing. There's a bunch of smart defaults there, and we'd like to find a way to bring that to the Bicep thing, which means humans could actually write and understand Bicep. That's a goal that we all have.
Yeah. Well, and when I'm wearing my enterprise architect hat, it's like reuse Bicep code we've written. Hey, we've put a bunch of policies into the right way to do this, and it upsets me that we're cut and pasting it between projects.
I'm over in Belgium right now, and on the plane over here, my colleague Paul wrote 600 lines of Bicep on the plane. And I'm like, I couldn't do that. I could write 600 lines of C#, but I can't write 600 lines of Bicep. It would not work.
Yeah. Do I want to be good at that? Right. Like, therein lies the problem. Like if you're at a place where you've gotten good at that, like, what do you do with your time?
You charge lots of money, Richard.
Yeah, I guess so, because most people don't want to do it. And the one person who knows how to do it is very busy.
Right.
But, back to the tooling that we talked about for Aspire, I think there's 2 other aspects that are pretty cool is with AZD, if you want, in the case of these .NET projects, these Aspire projects, you don't have any Bicep. There's no Bicep sitting out there for you to see.
Right.
You do that AZD up. We actually generate Bicep behind the scenes. We run it and we kind of get rid of it.
And then it goes away, which, this is the same stuff we started doing with databases, where we would generate, here's the state of your database. Here's the state you want to get to. The script to do the transformation is generated for you, and then it's gone.
But we do know some folks are going to care about that stuff. And so we did put tooling in for that as well. You can run AZD InfraSynth.
Right.
And what that tells it is to synthesize the infrastructure. At which point what will happen in your Aspire project is you'll get a infra folder, INFRA.
Yeah.
And inside of that, you'll get the bicep that we're going to run to publish your app to Azure.
This is the same thing we did with DBAs when they were anxious about this automation. It's like, I will let you validate each one of these scripts. And after a while, they just get tired of reading it because it's better code than they could write.
It's good. It's good code. I'm using a alpha feature of Aspire right now. That I think it'll probably be available with the general release of Aspire later this month. And in my case, because I have to run this in a early access data center, I actually have to generate the bicep, and then I need to go change the region of one of the components because all the components that I need for my Aspire app can't run in that special data center. And so I need to go flip one of them to West US. And so I just have to go search for log analytics, and then where it says location, I just hard code that to West US.
Right.
And bang. So there are cases and valid reasons you might want to go edit this stuff.
Yeah. I mean, is that the right way to go about it? Or is it when you do the generation, say, and when you have to decide this, make it this? Like, this seems like a parameter in that call.
It technically is a parameter today. When you filled in the location you wanted your app to be in, we actually used the parameter. But in my case, I had to choose an early access preview area, which doesn't have all the services. And so in my case, I had to make a bad choice. And then I had to go fix my bad choice.
Right. Just because it's a very specific case.
Yeah. I'm running alpha bits of even the services. And that's why, in my case,
But the point is, you didn't have to handcraft all this stuff. You still could use generated code, edit it, then run it.
Exactly. That's my point is if you want, bicep that you want to hand off to somebody so they can see the actual bits of how this work, then it's all there for you as well. The cool thing about Aspire is, let's say I started off with 2 projects. I've got my web front end, my web back end, and I decide I want to add a Redis cache. The cool thing is I can also go run that AZD InfraSynth again, and we'll look at the project folder again, and we'll see, oh, you added something new. And that new resource will just show up in there. And so you can rerun the tools, as you add things or add projects to your solution. They update. The final piece that I think is really exciting for me on the Aspire case is, we just talked about a cache or a Postgres database or a SQL database. What do all these things have in common? Connection strings. Connection strings suck as well because, if you're doing local development, you probably have a connection string to something on your local machine. And then when you push this thing to the cloud, you need a connection string to something in the cloud.
Right.
And Aspire supports this mechanism as well. So, just like we talked about service discovery, when I write an Aspire application, I don't ever see a connection string anywhere ever if I don't want to. So in the case of, I can go back to that, app host project, and I could say, hey, I don't have a project. I have a Redis cache. And then I can keep that Redis cache as a variable. And I can say my web front end has a with reference to that Redis cache, which then tells Aspire, make sure you boot the API up and the Redis cache up first. But even better, to add that Redis cache, I went to my app host, I right clicked and I said, add an Aspire component. And it gives you all of the cloudy, back end kind of components you can add there. I add that. That same with reference also takes the connection string information and injects it into the web front end project. And so when I'm in the web front end project, I right click and I add an Aspire component there. And I would select I could do output cache with Redis. I could just do Stack Overflow Redis. I could do either of those things. But when I add them, I don't have to add the connection string. All I do is when I create the API there, I just give it the name. And if I call my cache in the app host, I call it cache in my front end. And once again, Aspire is doing all the magic to share the connection strings across those boundaries. And so I never see a connection string. And even better,
I can't embed it in my code by accident.
Yes, exactly. Nowhere in your code do you have this dangerous connection string embedded that you're going to check into source control, get yourself in trouble if you're in public repos.
Yeah.
It's just all gone. And
well, because in the end, it is plumbing. So just make it for me.
Make it for you. Exactly. And so I've had more fun the last couple of months as we built the tooling for Aspire and using Aspire and just seeing my apps. And I'm like, I don't see ports. I don't see IP addresses. I don't see connection strings. And you think this is trivial, but all of us building ASP.NET Core projects have opened up the launch settings.json file and copy and pasted these things around your application. Or worse, you probably put a connection string in source code somewhere and you said, I'm not going to check it in, but you did. I mean, we have user secrets, which is a mechanism in ASP.NET Core to hide these things. But I'm at Microsoft. We have tools that scan our repos and tell us when we make mistakes like this. And they go off more than you would expect.
No, I've had GitHub barf back at me and say, this looks like a connection string. I'm not checking this in.
Now, where that gets even cooler is if you're in the Azure space. In many cases, one of our goals in Azure right now, it's been there forever. We're doubling down on it right now. Is you shouldn't even have a connection string. We have a capability in Azure called managed identity, and let me explain the idea behind managed identity. In the idea of managed identity, I created a managed identity resource, and I tell my web front end that not via code, via either the portal or via command line tools, I say that the web front end can talk to the Redis cache. And so there's nothing to steal because we've just codified or we've used infrastructure to say these two things can talk to each other.
Right.
You'd have to break my login. Yeah.
You can't even, you can't, if you even got to the portal, there is no connection string. There's nothing. All you do is reference the Redis database, and we just make that happen. And so, that's the point we really want to get to in the Azure space. We want to get to a place where there is no thing to steal. There is nothing that could be checked in because they just don't exist.
It's one step above Key Vault.
Yes. Key Vault is our solution if you have to have a connection string.
Right.
That this is one of the coolest aspects of the Azure components for Aspire is if the service that you're using supports managed identity, when you publish that app to Azure, the Aspire Publish Tech will actually create the managed identity, set the roles correctly, the permissions correctly for you on that managed identity, and there is no connection string at all.
Nice.
If the service you're using does not support managed identity yet, and I don't think there'll be many services by end of this year that don't support managed identity, we will then go and take that connection string, shove it into a Key Vault, and create the Key Vault for you. And, once again, as a developer, I don't have to think about that.
No. And you can't get it wrong either.
Aspire has abstracted all that away from me. And so, I'll kind of end on, we don't think this Aspire tech is necessarily just a .NET thing. Chris Harris on my team works on Python, and he has used the same Aspire host project for some of his Python applications, so we can get some of these same capabilities of being able to have the tech, build the infrastructure, set up all the security the right way, and do all those types of things. And so I do think you'll see us. We're past 101. Maybe we're at 201 now. At least for .NET, but we want to make sure that this multi-project run, this ability to create the resources on Publish and have resources locally, all of that, I would love to find ways to make that work for all developers in all languages. Because as we said, very likely I've got a Vue front end talking to a .NET back end. People mix all these technologies today already. And so, Aspire needs to be more than just .NET Island. It needs to be a technology that runs everywhere. And you might have heard, we talked about it probably on a podcast in the past. There was something called Project Tie. That was the predecessor to this. Project Tie was too .NET-y. The stuff we're talking about now, like the multi-project runner, that's a thing called DCP. That tech was actually built independent of Aspire on purpose. So we could actually take all this tech and make it work for all languages. AZD, obviously was built, it's not a .NET thing. It's built for all languages. And so the building blocks that we're building, hopefully will let us take this experience and make it cross language, cross platform.
If there's somebody out there listening, thinking that they're not quite convinced that, using .NET Aspire won't pigeonhole them and give them sort of these high level abstractions over things they can't manage or understand, can you address that person?
Yeah, I the reality is, if you look at a Aspire project, I'd say a couple things. We talked about the defaults. Those defaults are codified. And so there's nothing magic. What I would say the biggest thing is when people first see Aspire, the first thing is this is magic.
Right.
No, actually it's not. There's a file that contains all the defaults. And what's cool is we make that a project that you own. You can change those defaults. You can add your own new defaults. You can remove our defaults if you don't like those things. If you don't want to use our service discovery, take it out. If you go look at how service discovery actually works behind the scenes, there's nothing magic there. The cool thing is when I demo this, I would normally run the app and I would go in and show the environment variables of the front end. And inside the environment variables of the front end, what you're going to find is we injected the same localhost port number stuff as an environment variable. And all we're doing is actually reading that environment variable and using that in place of a hard-coded string. And what the host is the thing injecting this. And so as you dive deeper into this, what you're going to find is there's nothing locking you into anything here at all. In fact, crazily enough, if you want to take an Aspire app and you just have your own container, that's another feature of the host. I can go point it at any random container image, and I can give it the port numbers and all the stuff required to talk to that, and we can run that. In fact, that's how we do some of the JavaScript stuff. We actually can run Node.js projects.
So would one think of this as more like the ultimate Visual Studio template for creating an application?
I think so.
Yeah.
In the cloud, right? I mean,
but I mean a template that goes beyond your desktop
and solves all the multi-app problems that we have today.
Yeah.
And as I said, the multi-app problems are way more than just a .NET problem. They're everything. But what I would tell somebody is go read the Aspire documentation, and you're going to find out. We learned this when we built ASP.NET Core back in the day. One of the negatives of web forms was we had a whole bunch of automatic stuff that was on by default, and that's also probably why Aspire took so long to build. Is we still have a hangover from that. Mm-hmm. But notice that I said those defaults are actually in a project that you're referencing. You own it. Mm-hmm. The idea is, you can change, unlike web forms or I guess web forms is the right term for that. There was not a good way to change any of these defaults in web forms. You could change some of them in web config. You could change modules and stuff like that, but you really had to know what you were doing. And I think this is just it takes the ASP.NET Core mechanism of codifying the whole pipeline and just continues that.
And gives you control over the what's and the details as data.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love it.
And by the way, it won't be perfect, and we'll ship a V2.
Yeah, it's going to continue to iterate. The infrastructure is going to change, and all this is going to get better. But one of the things I'm excited about in this is this means scaling by default. Like you're in a structure that'll naturally scale. This means the idea of securing each individual component, limiting the number of ports that are open, like limiting the attack surface, because we're writing this as a manifest rather than doing it ourselves, and you're generating against it, you can close all that stuff off. You can lock it down as hard as it can be locked. And I don't have to write it. Like that's the main thing is
most importantly, right?
I don't get this stuff right.
Or you don't have to go read through 6,000 pages of documentation to figure out this stuff's even there. I mean, that's the biggest
by the
thing
way,
to me is
I'm not going to do. I'm not doing it.
We know our customers don't do it too, and that's why I think these types of things are super important. We have a person, his name is Uli, and I don't think I'm oversharing. He's the person that if you're a big customer and you're having an Azure problem, you might call him, and maybe he parachutes into your organization, helps you solve your problem. Mm-hmm. He gave us a bunch of crap in ASP.NET Core. He's like, you have all the features, but they're not on by default, and I have to just go to these customers and turn the features on by default. We also skipped over heavily. I think we're almost. I don't know. We won't have time to go very deep into this, but a really cool part of the Aspire tech as well is those defaults turn on all the open telemetry work.
Right.
Which means now when you run this application, you get a dashboard, and the dashboard is going to show you all the components. It's going to show you your crashes. It's going to show you the traces in a structured way. You can search for them. Today you would basically go to the cloud and look at logs. And this gives you a much better visualization. You can see your call path from the front end to the back end to the database. You can see how long each of those steps took. And so I think the telemetry aspect of this is super cool. One of the demos I've been showing this is not public yet until we GA Aspire later this month, is being able to run that dashboard in the cloud as well. So you'll be able to take the same Aspire dashboard you can run locally doing interloop development. And when you publish that to the cloud, you're going to see that same dashboard running in the cloud. Now, it won't be perfect because the dashboard doesn't have storage, which means it's going to show you more real-time stuff. If you want full storage, you're going to use something like Azure Monitor, but that's going to hook up to the same OpenTelemetry hooks that we're using for the dashboard. And so, I laugh when we were looking at ASP.NET Core, we recognized in ASP.NET Web Forms, we never had any telemetry at all. We fixed that with ASP.NET Core, and then with Aspire, we fixed that even more by wiring it up by default.
All right, real quick. Last question. On-prem. I know it's not a question, but is Aspire cloud only? Is it Azure only? Can I do this kind of stuff on-prem?
You can do it on-prem. I'd have to think harder about that. I mean, one of the things that as a developer, when I'm running on-prem is, and you might have already seen this, Carl, in many cases, if I want to run a Postgres or a RabbitMQ or a MySQL or even a SQL server, when you run your app locally on your machine, it can run those technologies in containers.
Yeah.
You can also decide in your app host that when you reference these things, you can give it connection strings. Those connection strings could be to local resources.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, all this stuff is open source. I'd have to just build a provisioning mechanism that when it's running, say, generate this stuff on my servers rather than the ones that are going to generate it on the cloud.
Right. You wouldn't use AZD to publish this because AZD isn't.
You'd use Octopus Deploy or something like that.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, cool.
But I can imagine somebody's going to build up this code base because they do want to deploy it on-prem or some part of it on-prem.
Yeah.
There's no reason not to. It's just containers. There's no voodoo here. Containers run anywhere.
Good stuff, Scott. But I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you. It's always great talking to you. I'm glad we got to catch up with you. And I guess it's dinner time where you are now. So
yes,
enjoy.
Thanks, folks.
All right. We'll talk to you next time on .NET Rocks. .NET Rocks is brought to you by Franklin's Net and produced by Plop Studios, a full-service audio, video, and post-production facility located physically in New London, Connecticut, and of course in the cloud. Online at pwop.com. Visit our website at dotnetrocks.com for RSS feeds, downloads, mobile apps, comments, and access to the full archives going back to show number 1. Recorded in September 2002. And make sure you check out our sponsors. They keep us in business. Now go write some code. See you next time. Got a transmitter banned by the FCC. Yes, I'm a